say every Cadian is born with a rifle in their hands, but that is a lie for the recruitment posters. The truth is more intimate. Every Cadian is born with a hum in their bones. For 10,000 years, the Pylons of Cadia have sung. It is a low-frequency thrum, a vibration of the very bedrock that resonates in the teeth and settles in the marrow. To a Cadian, that sound is the heartbeat of the world. It is the sound of the great enemy being held at bay. It is the sound of safety. Hasken Vane, a Pylon warden with 30 years of soot beneath his fingernails, and the grey of the Cadian interior in his hair, was adjusting the torque on a coolant manifold when the heartbeat stopped. It wasn't a fade, it wasn't a mechanical stutter, it was a sensory decapitation. One moment, the vast subterranean chamber of the Elysian Pylon field was alive with the familiar, bone-deep throb of Blackstone machinery. The next, the world went hollow. The silence wasn't just an absence of noise, it was a physical weight. It was a vacuum that seemed to suck the breath from Vane's lungs. He dropped the heavy wrench. It hit the rockcrete floor with a dull, pathetic clink that felt tiny and insignificant in the new, terrifying quiet. "Vane, did the Vox go out?" The voice belonged to Coles, a junior initiate, but it sounded wrong. It sounded thin, like paper tearing. Vane didn't answer. He stood paralyzed, his hands still shaped as if gripping the manifold. He was waiting for the vibration to return, for the world to start beating again. It didn't. "Pylon Alpha status," Vane roared, his voice echoing off the ancient, non-reflective geometry of the Blackstone monoliths. He forced his legs to move, his heavy boots feeling unanchored. Without the Pylon's resonance, gravity itself felt optional. "Coles, report to the cogitator bank. Now." Coles didn't move. He was staring at his hands. "Sir, my shadow. Look at my shadow." Vane looked. The emergency lumens were still active, casting a steady amber glow across the chamber. By all laws of the materium, Coles's shadow should have been cast behind him, elongated and dark against the cooling pipes. Instead, the shadow was crawling. It was detached from Coles's heels by a sickening inch, stretching toward the Pylon base not like a reflection of light, but like a predator sniffing the air. It moved at a different frame rate than the boy, twitching with a frantic insectoid energy, even though Coles stood perfectly still. "Ignore it," Vane hissed, though his own stomach lurched. Standard Pylon fluctuation protocol. The Blackstone is just resetting. Focus on the runes. But the runes were lying. Vane reached the primary console and stared at the green glow of the logic plates. They reported 100% stability. They claimed the Pylon was still drawing power, still vibrating at the exact frequency required to hold the Eye of Terror in its cage. But Vane's bones knew the truth. His bones were silent. "Sir," Coles whispered, his voice rising in pitch. "The water, the leak from the manifold." Vane turned. The coolant leak he had been fixing, a steady drip of viscous blue fluid, was no longer hitting the floor. The droplets were hanging in mid-air, suspended in a jagged diagonal line. As Vane watched, a single bead of fluid began to move. It didn't fall. It drifted upward, accelerating toward the ceiling, tracing a path that defied every law of Cadian physics. Then the first scream came. It didn't come from the deep tunnels. It came from the surface access elevator. Vane grabbed his shock maul, his knuckles white. "Coles, behind me. That's Trooper Hesk's post." The elevator doors hissed open. But Hesk wasn't standing guard. He was on his knees. The soldier was a veteran of 3 Black Crusades, a man whose nerves were supposedly made of tempered plasteel. Now he was sobbing, a wet, hacking sound that made Vane's skin crawl. Hesk's hands were clamped over his face, his fingers buried deep into his eye sockets. "It's too bright," Hesk shrieked. "Throne of Earth, it's too bright. I can see the clock. I can see the gears." "Hesk, drop your hands," Vane commanded, stepping forward. "The lights are at 40% power. It's dim, man." "No, the inner light," Hesk howled. He yanked his hands away and Coles let out a stifled cry. Hesk hadn't just scratched himself. He had attempted to dig his own eyes out with his bare fingers. Blood poured down his fatigues, staining the Cadian green a dark, muddy crimson. But the blood wasn't dripping down his chin. It was flowing upward in thin, jagged threads, weaving into the air like a macabre tapestry, forming shapes that looked uncomfortably like runes. "I can see the warp," Hesk whispered, his empty sockets staring directly at Vane. "I can see the thoughts of the stone, the pylons. They aren't machines, Warden. They're tombstones, and the dead are waking up." Hesk lunged. He didn't run. He seemed to slide across the floor as if the friction of the rockcrete had vanished. Vane swung the shock maul, the hum of the weapon the only familiar thing left in the universe. The blow connected with Hesk's ribs, but the sound wasn't the crack of bone. It was the sound of dry wood snapping. Hesk collapsed, but even in death, his body refused to obey the world. His limbs twisted into impossible angles, his torso elongating as if he were being stretched on an invisible rack. "Warden," Coles whimpered. He was pointing at the far wall, where a squad of interior guards had just burst through the bulkhead. Vane felt a momentary surge of relief. "Troopers, secure this sector. We have a biological contagion or a psych-resonant event." The troopers didn't respond. They didn't even look at him. There were 6 of them, and all 6 were engaged in the same frantic, rhythmic motion. They were clawing at their faces. Their helmets had been tossed aside, and they were using their combat knives, their fingernails, even the muzzles of their laser guns to ruin their own vision. "Why?" Coles breathed, his voice breaking. "The lights are fine. Why are they doing that?" "Don't look at them," Vane ordered, grabbing Coles by the shoulder and forcing him toward the emergency stairs. "Look at the floor. Look at your boots. Don't look at the air." Vane understood it then, with the cold, hard logic of a man who had spent his life tending to the barrier between reality and hell. The pylons hadn't just gone silent. They had failed, and without their stabilizing influence, the human mind, built to perceive 3 dimensions and a linear flow of time, was being flooded with the true nature of the universe. They weren't clawing their eyes out because of the darkness. They were clawing them out because they were seeing everything. They were seeing the atoms of their own bodies vibrating. They were seeing the ghosts of every man who had died on that spot. They were seeing the predatory geometry of the Great Rift as it prepared to swallow their world. They were blinding themselves to stay sane. "We have to get to the surface," Vane said, his voice a low growl. "We have to manual crank the dampeners. If we can get even 1 pylon to pulse, we can push this back. We can give the men a chance to fight." They began to climb. The spiral staircase felt miles long. Gravity shifted with every step. At one point, Vane felt as though he were walking on the vertical wall, his boots sticking to the metal with a magnetic, oily grit. The air began to smell of ozone and old rotted incense. Every landing was a fresh gallery of horrors. They passed a group of tech adepts who had been fused together into a single mass of flesh and red robes, their mouths moving in a silent, collective prayer. They passed a servo skull that was flying in tight, angry circles, screaming a binary code that sounded like a human weeping. Through it all, the silence persisted. That terrible, hollow absence of the pylon hum. Vane burst through the final pressure hatch onto the surface of Cadia. He expected the roar of battle, the thunder of chaos drop pods, the scream of interceptors. Instead, he found a nightmare of stillness. The Cadian sky was no longer grey. It was no longer the sky of a world. High above, the clouds had been torn asunder, not by wind, but by a celestial fracture. The Eye of Terror, once a distant bruise on the horizon, had expanded until it filled the zenith. But it wasn't purple or black. The sky was bleeding. Great curtains of a color that Vane's brain refused to categorize. A shimmering, oily bruise of ultraviolet and necrotic gold ripped across the heavens. It was a color that hurt to look at, a color that felt like a needle pressed against the optic nerve. Down in the valleys, the great blackstone pylons, miles-high needles of ancient rock, stood like silent, accusatory fingers. They weren't glowing. They were dark, their surfaces slick with a frost that looked like crystallized blood. Vane looked toward the horizon, toward the fortress city of Catastrophic. He expected to see the glow of the void shields. He saw nothing but the shivering air. And then, the tremor began. It wasn't shaking off the ground. The rock beneath Vane's boots remained steady. The tremor was internal. It was a shivering of the soul, a vibration that started in the center of his chest and radiated outward, making his teeth ache and his thoughts shatter. It was the sound of a billion screams distilled into a single, sub-vocal frequency. It was the sound of the planet's spirit breaking. "Warden," Coles whispered, looking up. "The stars, they're falling." Vane looked up. The stars weren't falling. They were being extinguished. One by one, the lights of the galaxy were being snuffed out by the encroaching bruise of the sky. The ground didn't move, but Vane felt the world tilt. Not a physical tilt, but a moral one. The anchor was gone. The weight of 10,000 years of duty, of sacrifice, of Cadia stands, was suddenly weightless. The sky let out a low, wet rumble, the sound of a lung filling with fluid. Vane fell to his knees, not because of the tremor, but because the silence had finally been replaced. The pylons were no longer humming. The warp was laughing. "Cadia stands," Coles whispered, clutching his laser gun like a holy relic. Vane looked at the boy, then at the sky that was no longer a sky. He felt the first drop of rain hit his cheek. It was warm. It was thick. It smelled of copper and ancient bitter salt. Vane wiped the liquid away and looked at his hand. The rain was red. And as the soul tremor intensified, Vane realized that the ground wasn't going to shake. It didn't need to. The world wasn't breaking apart. It was being unmade. He reached for his vox, hoping for a voice, any voice, to break the silence of the stone. "This is Warden Vane," he croaked into the dead air. "The pylons have failed. The silence is over." He paused, looking at the bruised, screaming sky. "God, Emperor, help us. It started." Chapter 2. The Meat in the Machine. The Voxcaster did not emit words. It emitted the sound of wet leather being stretched until it snapped. Vane held the receiver away from his ear, his face contorted. Beside him, young Coles was trembling so violently that the ceramic plates of his armor clattered together like wind chimes. They were crouched in the lee of a shattered basalt outcropping, 3 kilometers from the pylon field, overlooking the main arterial road that led to Catastrophic. "Mayday, Kasurkin Squad Theta 9, requesting immediate. Emperor, help us, the walls are breathing." The voice was distorted, not by the storm, but by a physical obstruction in the speaker's throat. It sounded as though the soldier were trying to talk through a mouthful of copper wire and warm suds. "Theta 9, this is Warden Vane," Vane barked. his military discipline overriding the bile rising in his throat. "State your coordinates. What is your status?" A burst of static shrieked, followed by a sound that made Vane's soul recoil. It was a chorus of screams, but they were synchronized, vibrating at the exact same pitch. "We are the status," the voice returned, now bubbling. "The Chimera, it didn't just stall. The air turned to syrup. We're part of the upholstery now. I can feel the fuel line in my femoral artery. I can see through the headlights. Please, just send a melter charge. Don't let us finish. Merging." Vane looked out at the road. A column of Cadian armored vehicles sat frozen in the crimson twilight. They hadn't been hit by shells. There were no scorch marks, no craters. They had simply stopped. As he adjusted his magnoculars, the military horror of a stalled retreat curdled into something far more obscene. The lead Chimera APC was shifting. Its adamantium hull was no longer rigid. It was rippling like the flank of a horse swatting flies. Where the troop hatch should have been, a row of human teeth, each the size of a shovel, had sprouted from the metal, gnashing aimlessly at the air. "Don't look, Coles," Vane whispered, but he couldn't look away himself. He saw a hand protruding from the side of the vehicle's turret. It wasn't stuck to the metal. It was growing out of it. The fingers moved in a frantic typing motion, trying to operate a weapon system that was now made of bone and fused muscle. The heavy bolter barrel was weeping thick, black bile, and every time the machine breathed, the smell of promethium mixed with the stench of an open abdominal wound wafted across the plains. This was the logistics of the fall. This was how the Wall of Martyrs became a literal, screaming, architectural fact. "We have to move," Vane said, his voice flat. He had reached the limit of what his mind could process as tragedy and had moved into the cold, dead space of survival. If the vehicles are merging, the ground isn't far behind. We stay off the rockcrete. We move through the shale. They began to descend the ridge, picking their way through the debris of a civilization that was losing its physical integrity. The narrative pressure of the invasion was no longer about an approaching army. It was about the environment itself becoming an apex predator. Every 100 meters, they encountered the wall. It was a defensive line of sandbags and Aegis shield generators that had been overrun. But the bodies of the Cadian 8th were not lying in the dirt. They were woven into the fortifications. Vane saw a Vox operator whose torso had become the base of a communications array. His ribs splayed open to act as satellite dishes, his tongue elongated into a copper wire that hummed with the screams of 1,000 dying channels. The logistics of planetary defense were failing not because the soldiers ran, but because reality had revoked their permission to exist as separate entities. "Warden," Coles gasped, stumbling over a mound of what looked like discarded gear. He had tripped over a courier satchel, still clutched by a severed arm that ended in a spray of crystalline blue glass. Vane knelt, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pried the satchel open. Inside was a data slate, its casing cracked, but its internal lumen still flickering with a defiant amber light. Vane swiped through the encrypted logs. His eyes widened. His breath hitched. "What is it, sir?" Coles asked, wiping red rain from his brow. "A command order," Vane whispered, the words feeling like ash. "Sent from High Command at Kasserkraf. Timestamp, 6 hours before the pylons went silent." He read the text aloud, his voice trembling. "Projected Blackstone destabilization, 99.8%. Pylon network failure imminent. Estimated window, 0300 hours. All units are to maintain current positions. No evacuations, no warnings. The morale of the populace must be preserved until the final breach." The layered revelation, hit Vane harder than the sight of the meat machines. They had known. Creed, the general staff, the Castellan, they had sat in their bunkers and watched the timers count down to the end of the world, and they had chosen to let their men die in the dark, clutching rifles that were about to turn into snakes. They left us. Coles breathed, the disciplined certainty of his Cadian upbringing finally shattering. They knew the heartbeat was going to stop, and they let us keep singing. They didn't just leave us, Coles, Vane said, looking at the wall of martyrs stretching into the fog. They used us as sandbags. They knew we were the meat in the machine, and they just wanted to make sure the gears were greased when the end came. Vane threw the data slate into the mud. He felt a sudden, violent surge of nihilism. Why fight for a world that has already signed your death warrant? Why stand when the ground was literally hungry for your shins? But the silence, that terrible pylonless silence, was being filled. For the last 10 minutes, a sound had been growing in the background. It was a high-pitched, thin wail, like a tea kettle left on a burner. Vane had assumed it was the wind whistling through the Blackstone Needles, or perhaps a distant Vox leak from the merged Kazarkin squad. It was constant. It was rhythmic. It was agonizing. Coles, shut that Vox off, Vane snapped, clutching his head. The screaming, it's drilling into my brain. Sir, Coles looked at him, his eyes wide with a new, distinct breed of terror. The Vox is dead. I smashed it 2 minutes ago when the officer started begging for the melter charge. Vane froze. He looked at Coles. The boy's mouth was shut. The wind was a low moan, yet the scream continued. It was louder now, a jagged vibrating ululation that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It felt intimate. It felt as though it were vibrating in Vane's own sinuses, echoing off the back of his teeth. He reached up to his throat, his fingers trembling. He felt the skin of his neck. It was tight. It was vibrating. He opened his mouth to speak, to tell Coles to run, to tell him that the will of the living was a lie. But no words came out. The scream, the one he had been hearing, the one he thought was a distant casualty, the one that was currently shattering the last of his composure, ripped out of his throat with the force of a physical blow. Vane's eyes bulged. He wasn't screaming because he was afraid. He wasn't screaming because he was in pain. He was screaming because his lungs were no longer his own. He was screaming because something else was using his vocal cords to tune itself to the frequency of the fall. And as Coles backed away, his face a mask of horror, Vane realized the most terrifying truth of all. The scream wasn't coming from the Vox. It was coming from him, and he couldn't stop it. Chapter 3. The Abyssal Tide. The sky didn't fall. It opened its mouth. Vane's scream had finally tapered off into a wet, whistling rattle, leaving his throat raw and tasting of iron. But the silence that followed was worse. Up until this moment, the Eye of Terror had been a distant cosmic wound, a tear in the fabric of the galaxy visible only through powerful scopes or the cursed sight of the warp-touched. Now, as Vane and Coles crested the final embankment overlooking the outskirts of Casa Kraf, the sky ceased to be an overhead canopy. It became an interior space. The clouds didn't just part. They peeled back like the lips of a gargantuan ulcerated wound. The ultraviolet bruising of the atmosphere curdled into a deep, necrotic violet, and for a terrifying second, Vane felt as though he were no longer standing on the surface of a planet, but was a parasite clinging to the roof of a giant's mouth. The abyssal tide of the warp wasn't coming down. It was inviting them in. "Don't look up, Coles," Vane wheezed, his voice a ghost of itself. "Keep your eyes on the transit spire. We reach the city, We find a Vox that isn't made of meat, and we get off this rock. But the Cadia craft they entered was no longer the bastion of imperial order. The world city, a fortress metropolis, designed by the greatest military architects of the Segmentum Obscurus, had become a shifting, non-Euclidean labyrinth. The transition from military horror to existential isolation was seamless and suffocating. As they moved through the outer hab blocks, the geometry began to betray them. They would walk down a straight, barricaded avenue of grey rockcrete, only to find themselves emerging from a doorway they had passed 10 minutes prior. A stairwell that should have led down to the sub-level transit lines instead wound upward into the open air, terminating in a jagged drop into a sea of mist that glowed with a sickly, rhythmic luminescence. "The map is wrong," Coles whispered, clutching the strap of his lasgun until his knuckles turned white. "Sir, the map slate says we're in Sector 4, but these are the statues from the plaza of St. Josman. That's 5 miles away." "The map is fine," Vane lied, his heart hammering against his ribs. "The world is what's wrong." The narrative pressure changed then. It was no longer the chaotic, visceral noise of Chapter 2. It became a cold, persistent dread. It was the introduction of the sound: clank, scrape, drag. It started as a rhythmic pulse, muffled by the heavy, sulphurous fog that now filled the streets. It wasn't the sound of an army. It was the sound of a single, massive weight being pulled across the pavement. It felt heavy, unbearably heavy, as if whatever was moving was composed of more mass than the air around it could support. Clank, scrape, drag. "Is that a sentinel?" Coles asked, his voice trembling. "A walker with a broken leg?" Vane shook his head, holding up a hand for silence. He peered through the swirling purple haze. He couldn't see the source, but he could feel it. The sound stayed a constant distance away. Always 3 rooms over, always 1 alleyway behind, always just out of sight. It was a stalking horror that didn't need to rush, because in a city where the streets looped back on themselves, there was nowhere for the prey to go. Clank, scrape, drag. The sound of the chain was the sound of inevitability. It was the sound of a hunter who knew the geography of the nightmare better than the architects who built the city. They pushed deeper into the distorted remains of the spaceport district. The extreme isolation was punctuated by the occasional sign of life, or what passed for it. They saw a squad of Cadian interior guards standing in a perfect line, their rifles presented at attention. As Vane and Coles approached, they realized the soldiers weren't moving, because their boots had melted into the rockcrete, fusing them to the planet's crust. Their eyes were open, staring at the sky mouth, their pupils dilated until the whites of their eyes were gone. They were still breathing, but the rhythm of their lungs matched the slow, agonizing clank-scrape drag of the thing in the fog. "We're close to the shuttle bay," Vane urged, ignoring the soldiers. He couldn't help them. No one could help anyone anymore. They reached Hangar 72. It was a cathedral of steel, miraculously intact amidst the warping architecture of the city. In the center of the bay sat an Arvus lighter. Its engines were humming, a beautiful, mechanical, sane sound that felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. The false hope loop began to tighten its noose. "It's fueled," Coles gasped, his face lighting up with a desperate manic joy. "Look at the thermal vents. Someone prepped it for evacuation. Sir, we can get out. We can break the atmosphere, find the fleet, and tell them about the pylons." Vane felt it too, that treacherous surge of adrenaline. They ran across the hangar floor, their boots echoing on the metal. The clank-scrape drag grew louder, faster, as if the hunter were finally closing the gap, but Vane didn't care. The shuttle was right there. The boarding ramp was down. The cockpit lights were a steady, reliable green. "I'll check the nav cogitator," Vane shouted, sprinting up the ramp. "Coles, secure the hatch." Vane burst into the cockpit. He reached for the pilot's throne, his hand shaking with the need to grip a flight stick, to feel the kick of thrusters. "Pilot, we have priority clearance. Initiate takeoff." Vane stopped. The words died in his throat, replaced by a cold, numbing horror that made the previous chapters feel like a dream. The pilot was there. He was sitting in the throne, his hands resting on the controls. He was wearing the flight suit of the Cadian First Transports, but the pilot wasn't a man anymore. His body had been hollowed out, his ribcage pulled wide and bolted to the sides of the cockpit to act as a frame for the instruments. His nervous system had been meticulously stripped from his flesh and woven into the shuttle's wiring. Hundreds of thin, wet nerves, glistening like silver thread, stretched from the pilot's empty eye sockets into the navcom. The shuttle wasn't fueled by promethium. It was fueled by the pilot's soul. The man's head lolled back. He had no eyes, only two glowing green vox emitters where his pupils should have been. "The flight is scheduled," the pilot's corpse whispered, the voice coming from the shuttle's own internal speakers. "But there is nowhere to go. The sky has teeth. The stars are digestion." The pilot's hands suddenly clamped down on the flight sticks. The engines roared, but the shuttle didn't lift. Instead, the floor of the hangar began to ripple. The metal became soft, like cooling wax. The Arvis lighter wasn't taking off. It was being absorbed into the floor, sinking into the hangar deck as if the building were a stomach. "Vane!" Coles screamed from the ramp. "The thing! It's here!" Vane spun around. At the base of the ramp, the fog finally parted. The stalking horror wasn't a demon, nor was it a traitor marine. At least, not in any way that made sense. It was a mass of blackstone shards and Cadian armor plates, held together by a pulsing, translucent muscle. It dragged a massive, rusted anchor chain behind it, the end of which was hooked into the jaw of a still-living Cadian officer who was being dragged along like a gruesome trophy. The creature didn't have a face. It had a hole where a face should be, and inside that hole, Vane could see the spinning gears of a Cadian pylon, miniaturized and screaming with a high-pitched, discordant whine. "Out!" Vane roared, leaping from the cockpit and tackling Coles off the sinking ramp. They hit the softening floor and scrambled toward the emergency exit. Behind them, the Arvis lighter let out a metallic groan, a sound of genuine, biological pain, as it vanished entirely into the hangar deck, the pilot's nervous system flickering one last time before being snuffed out. They ran. They ran through streets that were now turning into aisles of meat. They ran until the air became so thick with the scent of copper that Vane had to pull his tunic over his mouth to keep from vomiting. They reached the edge of the city, the great Cadian Gate, the massive, miles-wide fortification that was supposed to be the shield of the Imperium. It was the ultimate symbol of Cadian defiance, the gate that would never break. Vane stopped. He looked up at the monumental structure. "Coles," Vane whispered. "Look at the gate." Coles looked. He began to laugh, a thin, brittle sound that signaled the final snap of his sanity. The Cadian gate was no longer made of stone and reinforced plasteel. The monumental walls, the bastions, the gun emplacements, they were all shivering. As the warp light from the sky mouth hit the structure, the rockcrete transmuted. The impenetrable fortress was now a wall of pale, wet ivory. The gun embrasures were no longer holes for cannons. They were pores in a colossal, gums-and-all landscape. The millions of tons of stone had become billions of interlocking, jagged teeth stacked high into the bruised sky. The gate wasn't a wall anymore. It was a moor. And as a massive tectonic tremor finally shook the earth, not a movement of plates, but the closing of a jaw, Vane realized the final, devastating truth of their isolation. They weren't defending a planet. They were standing on a tongue. Cadia stands, Coles giggled, falling to his knees as the teeth of the horizon began to descend. Cadia stands, and now, Cadia eats. Vane looked at the sky mouth, then at the teeth gate closing in from the horizon. The scream he had been holding back since the Pylons died finally returned. But this time, he didn't try to stop it. He just watched as the light of the stars was bitten in half. Chapter 4: The Calculus of Loss. The countdown didn't appear on the screen. It didn't beep with the sterile precision of a digital clock. It began as a series of sudden, sharp pains in the back of Haskin Vane's neck, each one a rhythmic throb that pulsed in time with the death of a Cadian soul. It was a genetic ledger, a countdown for the extinction of a bloodline. Vane stumbled through the transmuted ruins of the spaceport, his fingers clawing at the skin of his throat. With every throb, a name he hadn't thought of in years surfaced in his mind, then vanished into a puff of grey smoke. Titus, Ilara, Crane, names of cousins, nephews, and ancestors he had never met. He could feel them being erased. This wasn't just the death of individuals. It was the systematic deletion of the Cadian genome from the tapestry of existence. 21 million, Vane croaked, the number manifesting in his mind like a brand. 21 million left. Coles was no longer behind him. Coles was no longer anything. The boy had stopped 10 minutes ago, fascinated by his own hands as they began to turn into translucent salt. He had waved a shimmering, crystalline goodbye before shattering into 1,000 glittery shards under the pressure of a passing warp squall. Vane hadn't looked back. There was no room for mourning in the calculus of loss. The physical environment was no longer a stage. It was a disappearing act. The narrative pressure of the chapter was dictated by the literal vanishing of the floor. As Vane ran toward the high-altitude command spires, the rockcrete beneath his boots didn't crack. It simply ceased to be. One moment he was stepping on a solid, reinforced slab. The next, he was leaping over a void of swirling, violet nothingness, where a street had been a second before. The world was being edited in real time. Cadia stands, Vane whispered, the words tasting like copper and ash. He saw a group of Kazakhin ahead, huddled in a circle. They weren't fighting. They weren't even looking at the sky. They were sitting in the middle of a bridge that was slowly turning into a row of weeping willow trees made of human hair. They were polishing their combat knives with an obsessive, terrifying focus. "Move!" Vane screamed at them as he leaped over a gap of unreality. "The spire is still holding. We can reach the Vox arrays." One of the Kasrkin looked up. His face was a smooth, featureless mask of skin. His eyes and mouth had been voted out by the shifting laws of physics. He didn't speak, but he tapped the side of his helmet. The message was clear. To where? To what? Vane kept running. The nihilism of the moment wasn't a choice. It was an atmospheric condition. The realization hit him with the weight of a falling star. Cadia stands was never a promise of victory. It was a lie of convenience. It was a mantra designed to keep the meat in the machine, to ensure that the guns stayed manned while the elite prepared their own escapes or their own glorious, useless deaths. The High Command hadn't stayed silent to preserve morale. They had stayed silent because the truth, that the Pylons were not shields but digestive enzymes, was too horrific to utter. He reached the spire of the Castellan's reach. The stairs were gone, replaced by a series of floating, disconnected platforms that drifted like lily pads in a pond of liquid gravity. Vane climbed, his muscles screaming, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. Every time his heart beat, the genetic countdown ticked down. 12 million, he gasped, pulling himself onto a ledge. 11 million. He reached the primary observation deck. The glass had been blown out, but the air inside was still, heavy with the scent of ozone. In the center of the room sat a holographic display, one of the few things that still seemed to function with Imperial logic. But the display wasn't showing troop movements or enemy positions. It was showing a cross-section of the planet. Vane collapsed in front of the console, his eyes wide. This was the retention trigger, the layered revelation that would haunt him for the final hour of his life. The pylons weren't just failing, they were feeding. The Blackstone wasn't a passive material. As the Eye of Terror expanded, the pylons had begun to resonate at a frequency that didn't repel the warp, but harmonized with it. The hologram showed the deep roots of the pylons, miles beneath the crust, turning into a network of hungry, obsidian capillaries. They were drawing the life force, the psychic resonance, and the physical matter of Cadia into themselves. "It's not breaking," Vane whispered, watching as the holographic representation of the planet's core turned from a solid white to a hollow, pulsing black. "It's being digested. The pylons are the teeth, and the Blackstone is the stomach." The great enemy hadn't come to destroy Cadia. They had come to harvest the result of 10,000 years of pylon incubation. Cadia was a fruit that had finally ripened, and the fall was merely the sound of the skin breaking. Vane looked out the shattered window. The teeth gate he had seen earlier was now miles high, a jagged silhouette of ivory against the ultraviolet sky. The horizon was no longer a horizontal line. It was a curve that was slowly bending inward, as if the planet were folding in on itself to fit into a smaller, darker space. 6 million, Vane choked out. The pain in his neck was a constant, searing burn now. He was one of the last, a survivor of a race that was being deleted. And then, the light changed. The bruised violet of the sky was eclipsed by a shadow so vast, so total, that it felt like the sun had been extinguished forever. It wasn't a cloud. It wasn't a warp storm. It was a ship. But to call it a ship was like calling a mountain a pebble. The Will of Eternity, Abaddon's Blackstone fortress, began its descent into the atmosphere. It didn't glide. It fell with the slow, agonizing weight of a funeral shroud. It was a jagged, star-shaped geometry of black stone and malevolent light, so massive that its arrival displaced the air with a roar that shattered every remaining pane of glass in the city. Vane stared up at it. It wasn't a vessel of war. It was a tombstone. It was a monument to the end of all things, a physical manifestation of the fact that no amount of courage, no amount of standing, and no amount of sacrifice could stop the calculus of loss. The fortress didn't fire its weapons. It didn't need to. Its mere presence in the sky was a terminal sentence. It was the lid of the casket closing. Vane reached for his sidearm, not to fight, but to find a quicker way out than the digestion of the world. But his fingers were no longer fingers. They were soft white stalks of fungus, growing toward the dark shadow in the sky. 5 million, the countdown whispered in his brain. As the Will of Eternity filled his entire field of vision, its black surfaces shimmering with the reflected light of a dying world, Vane realized that the scream he had heard earlier wasn't his own, and it wasn't the warp. It was the planet, finally realizing it was dead. The shadow of the fortress touched the ground, and the world went black. Chapter 5. Fragments of a Broken Faith. The sound of a world dying is not a bang. It is a wet, structural snap, like a spinal column breaking under the weight of a mountain. Haskin Vane didn't hear it with his ears. He heard it through his teeth. He heard it through the fluid in his eyes. The core of Cadia, the molten iron heart that had sustained 10,000 years of steel-eyed defiance, cracked. The vibration translated through the rockcrete floors, up through Vane's boots and into his nervous system, turning every nerve ending into a sensory wire for the planet's extinction. It was the final breath of a world, a billion lungs exhaling their last measure of oxygen as the tectonic plates ceased to be geography and became shrapnel. Vane lay on the observation deck of the Castellan's Reach, his body a ruin of fungal growth and brittle bone. Above him, the will of eternity didn't just loom. It sat upon the atmosphere like a lid on a coffin. The shadow was so absolute that light had become a memory. The only illumination came from the friction of the planet's crust grinding against itself, casting a hellish subterranean orange glow that flickered in the gaps where the sky used to be. 104, Vane whispered. The countdown in his head had slowed. There were only 104 souls left on this side of the continent who still shared the Cadian bloodline. The census of a species reduced to the population of a single barracks. The emotional trajectory had shifted. The panic of the meat machines was gone. The horror of the teeth gate was a distant tremor. What remained was a cold, crystalline acceptance of the void. This was the humanity versus the inevitable moment. The quiet, final dignity of a candle burning in a hurricane. Vane looked at his hands. They were barely recognizable, the skin translucent and weeping a pale silver ichor. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small, battered metal cylinder. It was a physical Vox recorder, an archaic piece of tech used for field logs. It was heavy, real and untainted by the warp-resonant logic of the city's Vox arrays. The narrative pressure was no longer about escape. There was no away to go to. The pressure was about the name. It was about ensuring that when the history of the galaxy recorded the fall of this bastion, it didn't just record a number or a strategic loss. It had to record that a man named Haskin Vane had existed, that he had held his post, and that he had remained human until the laws of physics told him he couldn't be. "This is Warden Haskin Vane," he said into the recorder. His voice was a rasp, a dry leaf skittering over stone sound. "I am 32 years a servant of the Pylons. I was born in the shadow of the Elysian field. I had a wife named Mara. I had a son who died at the Tyrock fields. I am not a casualty. I am a witness." He paused, the floor beneath him tilting at a 45-degree angle as the spire began to slide into a newly formed abyss. "The Pylons didn't fail us," he whispered, a sudden sharp clarity piercing through the nihilism. "We were never meant to be protected. We were meant to be the seal. We were the wax on the letter, and the great enemy has finally broken the seal to see what was written inside." Then came the memory loop, the retention trigger designed to pull the listener back to the very first second of the story. Vane closed his eyes, and for a moment, the screaming sky and the falling fortress vanished. He was back in Chapter 1. He was back in the subterranean silence of the Pylon field. He remembered the moment the hum stopped. In the beginning, he had viewed that silence as a violation. He had seen it as the ultimate warning of doom. But now, as the warp winds howled through the broken spire and the stars were eaten by the Blackstone fortress, he realized the truth. The silence wasn't a warning. It was a mercy. The Pylons had provided a 10,000-year silence so that humanity could hear itself think. They had held back the screaming madness of the universe just long enough for a civilization to build, to love, and to fight. The hum was the sound of a wall holding. The silence that followed was the last quiet moment the galaxy would ever know. He hadn't appreciated the peace of that first minute. He had spent it in fear when he should have spent it in prayer. "We didn't know how loud the universe was," Vane murmured. "The stone was keeping us quiet. It was keeping us safe." A violent jolt threw him against the far wall. The spire was falling. Outside the window, he saw a continent-sized slab of Cadia drift upward, its ocean spilling into the void like wine from a shattered glass. The atmosphere was stripping away, leaving only the raw, freezing vacuum of space, infused with the predatory heat of the eye. The planet was breaking before the guard did. Even now, as the crust shattered into a billion fragments, Vane's internal ledger ticked. 82, 65, 40. The voxcasters across the fragmenting world were still active, driven by emergency batteries or possessed by the lingering echoes of dead operators. They began to broadcast. It wasn't a call for help. It was the litany of sacrifice. From 1,000 different shattered peaks and drifting hab blocks, a chorus of voices rose through the static. "I am the guard. I am the shield. I am the stone that does not break." The voices were overlapping, some human, some distorted by the warp, some mere machine spirits repeating their last programmed commands. They screamed into the darkness as the pieces of Cadia drifted into the maw. "The planet breaks before the guard." Vane felt the countdown hit 1. He was the last, the final fragment of the Cadian bloodline on this side of the rift. He felt a strange, terrifying lightness. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was the end of a story. He pressed the save button on the recorder and threw it into a pocket of localized gravity, a swirling vortex of debris that might, through some miracle of the warp, find its way into the cold vacuum and out into the path of a passing Imperial ship. The spire collapsed. Vane fell into the bruised ultraviolet clouds. He didn't scream. He watched the will of eternity grow smaller as he drifted away on a chunk of rock-crete that used to be his home. He saw the heart of Cadia, glowing a brilliant, dying white, before it was swallowed by the black stone of the fortress. The screen of his life was fading to black. The stays with you resolution wasn't a victory. It was a lingering haunting. As the physical world vanished, the audio in the listener's ears should begin to strip away. The roaring wind, the grinding stone, the screaming voices, all of it fading into a thin, electronic hiss. Through the hiss, a single unshielded vox signal flickered. It wasn't Vane. It wasn't a litany. It was a small, quiet, human voice, drifting from a fragment of the world so far away it was almost a star. "This is Station 7. Is anyone?" The voice was calm. It was the sound of someone who didn't know the world was over, or perhaps someone who knew and simply didn't care. "Is anyone still listening?" The signal was cut out. The silence returned, not the mercy silence of the Pylons, but the silence of a grave